שלום לכולם, תודה רבה אלונה וינוגרד, תודה רבה אייל אברהמי. אני שאול אמסטרדמסקי, אני מאוד מאוד שמח על ההזדמנות שניתנה לי להיות כאן, ולראיין מישהי שבעיניי היא אחת העיתונאיות המופלאות ביותר של התקופה שלנו, ועכשיו ברשותכם אני אעבור לאנגלית. Hello, Mariса Kwiatkowski, how are you?
I'm good, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you very much. I'll just introduce you to the audience. Marisa Kwiatkowski is an American journalist. She's an investigative reporter. She's working today for USA Today and used to work for the Indie Star. She has won multiple awards, about 40 if I'm correct. One of them closest to my heart is the 2019 Lions Award, awarded to her by my Neiman class back in Cambridge. So good job, Marisa, for that. We're going to talk about probably the biggest story you've exposed together with your colleagues, the Larry Nassar story, which is really once in a lifetime kind of story. I'm sure you agree. Can you take me back, please, to the moment when you understood this is a tremendous story and I'm gonna report it. I'm gonna unfold it.
It was actually pretty early in the process. You know, a lot of times when you work on an investigation, you have a hypothesis or you have things that people are telling you, but you're not really sure until you kind of get into it what the facts are. What was unique about this particular investigation is the fact that from the very beginning, we knew what USA Gymnastics policy was for how they handled child sexual abuse allegations, because from almost the first day, I had copies of pieces of depositions from current and former high-ranking USA Gymnastics officials that described what their policy was. Mm-hmm. And so we knew pretty early on that it was going to be something that was important to uncover. And sort of the next step was, what is the impact of this policy on the safety of kids in the sport?
Did you imagine the magnitude of misconduct that was going on behind the scenes?
You know, we never really thought about it in that way, or at least I didn't while I was going through. It was more about what is the next thing I have to do, the next, you know, piece of information that I have to get, not thinking about really the scope or the magnitude of it. I think it really took kind of getting past working on the investigation to kind of understand how big it became, you know, because when you're in it, you're really just kind of focused on the tasks at hand.
Right. Yeah. Can you share how did it feel to work on this story? I imagine how many different stories you wrote about this story?
Oh,
Hundreds,
my goodness.
I guess.
I mean, have no idea.
At least dozens. Okay, so can you share, please, the process of how your day-to-day looked like? Because I can imagine that at one point or another, maybe one gets tired of writing about the same thing. I don't know. Can you share, please?
I think for my colleagues and I, it was a pretty much constant state of exhaustion for a while there. But, you know, the great thing about the team that we had, and it was myself, Mark Alicia, and Tim Evans, our editor, Steve Berta, is that we were really sort of approaching it from a divide and conquer perspective. So we all sort of took different aspects of it and brought all of our pieces together, which required a lot of communication, but that's sort of how we operated. And so we were working on a lot of things at one time. We worked, you know, mornings, days, nights, weekends, and we were constantly communicating kind of throughout the reporting process. You know, it's hard to think about, you know, when you asked me, you know, the magnitude of it, right? We were just thinking about like, okay, I've checked this thing off the list. What's the next thing on the list that we have to dig into? And it was like that for almost 2 years, which is pretty unusual when you think about an investigation as well, as taking that long on it.
Yes. And how did your editors, I mean, as a journalist, we never get this privilege to work for 2 years on the same story. How did your editors give you that privilege, handed you that privilege? What's the process of, you know, the editing of that story and realizing we need to dedicate lots of resources reporting this story?
I was incredibly fortunate to have the support of our editors from day one. You know, from the day that I got that first tip and I said, you know, I can't get these records any other way. Can I fly to Georgia and pick them up? from that very first day, they were like, yes, go, which is also incredibly unusual, right? To get that kind of buy-in so quickly. And they were supportive from that first day throughout the entire process. And they invested not only all of the time of my colleagues and I, but also the resources to fly and interview survivors throughout the country, to request records throughout the country. And it was never a conversation of like, hey, you guys need to be done now. It was more about, okay, what's the next thing that you're thinking about? What's the next thing that's on your plate? And, you know, it actually ended up being longer than 2 years, but there were spaces when, you know, things might calm down and we sort of chipped away at other stories, but then we always ended up coming back to this investigation.
How long have passed since the first tip you got until the first story was published?
It would have been about 4.5 months from getting the tip. I got the tip in March of 2016. We published our first piece in the investigation in August of 2016. That's
amazing. And do you remember the first time that you approached, I guess, the gymnastics, the Olympic Committee, or I don't know who, to ask for a request? Do you remember that moment? Request for a comment. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, we actually made our initial request in writing. We sent them an email actually pretty early on in the process. I want to say it was May, was the first time that we had reached out to them, asking them for an interview, letting them know what we were working on. But it wasn't the last request. We actually, you know, continued to go back and forth with them. They initially denied our requests for interviews in person. They were answering questions in writing. And we continued to go back and forth actually right up until publication with them.
Was there any, were you afraid that they're gonna, you know, try to abort the publication, try to sabotage your investigation, anything?
I think, again, what made this particular investigation somewhat unique is that we had their policy in their own words. Mm-hmm. And so it was hard for them to argue that that had not been true. And so for us, you know, it's really about understanding, you know, the impact of that policy, but also had they changed the policy, because the depositions weren't that old, but they were obviously not from the day before. And so we wanted to also make sure that we understood, you know, is this still the policy that's in place today? And it took us a lot of going back and forth with the organization to confirm that, in fact, it was true that it was a policy that had been in place since the 90s at least, and that it was still the policy that was in place today.
What did this really tremendous investigation taught you about being an investigative reporter?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. You know, I think I learned a lot throughout the process. I think, you know, with any investigation, you learn a lot. I think one thing that really shone through in this particular investigation is the power of one voice and the power of a survivor's voice, and how we saw throughout the investigation that one person coming forward and sharing their story with the public to help the public understand what was going on led to many others. And in fact, when you think about the Larry Nassar investigation, that really is because of the survivors who spoke out in that first piece in our investigation. It was that work that spurred other survivors of Larry Nassar to reach out to us and say, you know, I really think you should be looking at this person.
Right. So if any young investigative reporters or young journalists watch us now, and they wonder, should they become investigative reporters? It's hard work. What would be your tip from your experience to those young journalists?
It's hard work, but it's incredibly rewarding work. You know, we do this work because we want to expose wrongdoing. We want to make a difference in the communities that we serve. And I've been incredibly fortunate to work for publications that support that kind of work. And I would absolutely encourage the next generation, you know, we need you. I would absolutely encourage them to continue to pursue this work. And you don't have to have, I think it's important that young journalists know, you don't have to have the title investigative reporter to do this kind of work. You can do this kind of work regardless of what your job title is. You know, I started doing investigations when I was covering a beat. I was covering local government. And then I was covering criminal courts. And so there are opportunities to make a difference regardless of what your formal title is in doing this work.
Speaking of making a difference, did you ever imagine that your reporting, your investigation would make such an impact?
I think the credit for that really goes to the survivors and to the people who trusted us with their stories throughout this process. You know, without them and without their strength and the work that they did, I don't know that we'd be where we are today. I am incredibly proud of the work that my colleagues and I did, but you know, it didn't happen sort of in isolation. It took a lot of pieces coming together to see change start to happen. And while I'm proud of the work we've done, I'd also say there's still a lot that could be done to make kids safer, right? That it's not like everything's fixed today, you know?
Yeah, unfortunately, I do know. Mariса, we're approaching the end of this interview. When you choose the beats that you want to cover, what are your, I mean, why do you cover the things that you cover? Why do you choose such hard topics? Because it's hard.
I've always been drawn to stories about people. And particularly when there are systems that are broken that are causing people harm. And so that's kind of where my work is focused. And yeah, it's incredibly difficult work, but it's also incredibly difficult for those people to go through those things. And so I think about it that, you know, in my work, because I can write about these topics, that I should be writing about these topics. And unfortunately, there's no shortage of things to write about, right?
Yeah.
You know, and I think that I'm incredibly fortunate that I can dig into these kinds of topics. And I'd love to say I work myself out of a job someday, or that all of my colleagues working together work myself out of a job, but I don't know if that'll happen.
Mariса, one last question, and I hope it's not too personal. Some of the testimonies, some of the stories that you uncovered are hard to read. And I imagine that, you know, it takes a mental toil on the reporter as well. How, as an investigative reporter, how do you deal with that?
I think that is true whether you're doing investigations or even if you're covering breaking news and writing about, you know, crime or courts or trauma. I think it can take a toll. It's tough to write about, you know, what is sometimes the worst day of somebody's life every day.
Right.
For me, you know, I think everyone has to find the thing that works best for them. For me, I found that, you know, checking in with myself and taking a break when I need it. So, you know, I like to exercise, I love to read. And so when I do need to take a moment for myself, I don't feel bad about taking that because I'm a better journalist when I do take that time. You know, and my colleagues also had their own sort of process. My colleague, Mark, you know, his outlet for this kind of work was gardening. For Tim, it was music. And, you know, so everyone finding their thing, and preferably a healthy thing, right? But finding a thing that works for them and not being afraid to admit when you need that break.
Yeah, and that's a good advice because it's hard to forget that when we are immersed in our work. And, you know, it seems like the days, you know, it's just one long day of reporting. Marisa Kwiatkowski, thank you very much for sharing your story, and thank you very much for your time. It's been an honor and a pleasure interviewing you. Thank you.
Thank you.